I walked into my father-in-law's living room clutching a small bouquet of faded daisies and a homemade card. The festive balloons sagged listlessly in the corner, their helium long spent, and the half-eaten cake on the coffee table looked abandoned. My heart thudded against my ribs as I searched the silent house. No laughter, no music, no family. Only Mrs. Alvarez, his caregiver, stood by his wheelchair with a sympathetic expression and eyes that spoke of too many lonely afternoons. The living room of Frank's modest Brooklyn apartment had been decorated with what must have once been colorful streamers, now drooping from the ceiling like wilted flowers. I'd rushed here straight from my shift at the hospital, taking 2 buses and a subway to make sure I wouldn't miss his 80th birthday celebration. The invitation from my husband's sister, Diane, had specified 3 p.m. It was now 3:30, and the room felt like the aftermath of a party rather than the beginning of one. "Where is everyone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I placed the daisies, Frank's favorites, on the side table next to a framed photo of his late wife, Margaret. Mrs. Alvarez shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her floral apron. "They came early, Miss Sarah. They had cake, took some photos." She trailed off, glancing at Frank, who sat motionless in his wheelchair, staring out the window at the brick wall of the neighboring apartment building. She gently placed a hand on my shoulder and explained, in hushed tones, that everyone had quietly left 2 days ago for a surprise trip to Hawaii, without him. The words landed like stones in my chest. I sank into the nearest armchair, stunned by the weight of betrayal that clung to the stale air. Each breath felt ragged, the room spinning as if mocking the joyous occasion I'd envisioned. "They said." Mrs. Alvarez hesitated, her Mexican accent thickening with emotion. "They said it would be too difficult to take him, that he would slow them down." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband, David, had told me he was on a business trip to Chicago and would miss his father's birthday. I'd been disappointed but understood. His new position at the architectural firm demanded these sacrifices. But a family vacation? To Hawaii? Without even telling me? When did they leave? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tuesday morning," Mrs. Alvarez replied. "They came for the early celebration on Monday, took pictures for social media, and then..." She made a flying gesture with her hand. Whoosh. Tuesday. 2 days ago. While I had been working double shifts at the pediatric ward, sleeping at the hospital to cover for a colleague with the flu, my husband had been boarding a plane to Paradise with his mother, his 2 sisters, and their families. The half-eaten cake suddenly made sense, chocolate with buttercream frosting, Frank's favorite that he could barely eat anymore due to his dentures. They had staged a birthday moment, captured it for their Instagram feeds, and then abandoned him on his actual birthday. I knelt beside my father-in-law, gently brushing a stray lock of silver hair from his forehead. His face was serene, almost peaceful, but his eyes carried a quiet ache. I felt the first tremors of anger ripple through me, a protective fury mingled with heartbreak. This day was supposed to celebrate his life, yet here he sat, abandoned by those who claimed to love him most. "Frank," I said softly, using the name he'd insisted I call him from the day David first introduced us, "I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible." I decided not to mention I'd been led to believe the celebration was happening now, not 2 days ago. "But I'm here, and we're going to have a proper birthday, you and me." His eyes shifted slowly from the window to my face. For a moment, he looked confused, as if trying to place me in his increasingly fragile memory. Then a flicker of recognition crossed his features, followed by a small, grateful smile that broke my heart all over again. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You came?" "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss your birthday for the world." Mrs. Alvarez quietly excused herself to the kitchen, mentioning something about a fresh pot of coffee, leaving me alone with Frank in the sad remains of what should have been a joyful gathering. I looked around at the evidence of the family's deception, the sagging balloons, the abandoned cake, the stack of unopened gifts in the corner that were probably just empty boxes for show. Frank had been an architect, just like David was now, designing buildings that would stand for generations. He'd built schools, libraries, and community centers across New York, structures that sheltered and served thousands. How could they treat him like he was disposable, a prop to be used for their curated social media lives and then set aside? I squeezed his hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent veins, the hands that had once drafted blueprints for buildings that transformed skylines, that had once held my husband as a child and taught him to ride a bike in Prospect Park. We're going to make this right, I promised, though I had no idea how. All I knew was that this man deserved better than to be forgotten in the twilight of his life, that the ache in my chest wouldn't subside until I found a way to restore his dignity. And perhaps, in the process, I would discover what had happened to the family I thought I had married into, and the husband I thought I knew. The phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the heavy silence. I answered, forcing a steady breath as my mother-in-law's voice exploded through the speaker, cheerful and mocking. We're having a great time here. We came without you, and without this useless old man. Ha ha ha. Her laughter echoed cruelly, each syllable like a jagged shard cutting deeper into my resolve. It was Frank's landline, an old rotary phone he refused to replace despite David's repeated offers to upgrade him to something digital. I hesitated, wondering if I should answer, but Frank nodded slightly, giving me permission. Frank Miller's residence, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Oh, Sarah? Is that you? Patricia's voice registered surprise before quickly recovering. Why are you at Dad's place? I thought you were working all week. Before I could respond, I heard voices in the background, splashing water, laughter, the clink of glasses. Someone called out another Mai Tai, Pat, and my mother-in-law briefly covered the receiver, her muffled voice ordering another round of drinks. Sorry about that, she continued, the forced pleasantness in her tone now tinged with impatience. We're having a great time here, we came without you. And without this useless old man, ha ha ha. Her laughter echoed cruelly, each syllable like a jagged shard cutting deeper into my resolve. I looked at Frank, wondering if he could hear her through the receiver. The slight droop of his shoulders told me he could. Patricia, I said slowly, measuring each word, today is Frank's actual birthday. I came to celebrate with everyone, but there's no one here except Mrs. Alvarez. A pause stretched between us, filled only by the distant sounds of Hawaiian paradise. Oh, she finally said, her tone dismissive. We did the birthday thing already. You know how Dad is these days. He can barely remember what day it is anyway. David didn't tell you? We decided to combine the celebration with a family vacation. It would have been such a hassle to bring Dad along. All those wheelchair accommodations, his medications, his issues. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the phone, fury surging hotter than shame. I could almost see her lounging by the ocean, cocktail in hand, reveling in her own callousness. I glanced at my father-in-law, whose lips quivered as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. In that moment, I vowed silently that their contempt would not define him or me. Is David there? I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. He's in the water with the kids. Jennifer's little ones are learning to surf. It's just adorable. Patricia's voice dripped with smug satisfaction. We've got the most gorgeous rental right on Waikiki Beach. 5 bedrooms, private chef. David's firm is doing so well, you know. Though I suppose you wouldn't see much of that with your modest hospital salary. I inhaled sharply. Patricia had never approved of me, a nurse from Queens who'd met her son during his residency at a public hospital before he'd followed in his father's footsteps to become an architect. In her eyes, I'd always been beneath the Miller family standards, despite Frank's immediate and warm acceptance. I see, I said, my voice growing colder. And you didn't think to invite me to this family vacation either. Patricia's laugh was brittle. Oh, Sarah, don't be dramatic. David said you couldn't possibly take time off from your job. Those sick children need you so much more than a frivolous beach vacation, don't they? You're always so dedicated. The way she emphasized the word made it sound like a character flaw. In the background, I heard David's voice growing closer. Mom, who are you talking to? It's your wife, Patricia replied, not bothering to cover the receiver. She's at your father's, making a fuss about his birthday. There was a rustling sound as David apparently took the phone. Sarah? What are you doing at Dad's? The confusion in his voice was genuine, which somehow made everything worse. He truly hadn't thought about me being there, about his father sitting alone on his birthday while they celebrated in Hawaii. "It's your father's 80th birthday, David," I said quietly. "The invitation from Diane said 3 p.m. today. Remember? The one she sent to the hospital because she said she couldn't reach me otherwise." "Oh, shit," he muttered. "That was just for show, Sarah. For Dad's social media post. We actually did the celebration on Monday before we left. Didn't Mom tell you about our trip?" "No," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hand. "No one told me anything. Not about the early celebration, not about Hawaii. Nothing. Look, I'm sorry about the confusion. I really thought Mom would have mentioned it to you. But Dad wouldn't have been able to handle the trip anyway. You know how he gets confused with changes in routine." I looked at Frank, who was watching me intently now, his eyes clearer than I'd seen them in months. He didn't look confused at all. He looked hurt and betrayed by his own son. "Your father is more aware than you give him credit for," I said. "And he deserves better than this." David sighed, the sound of a man inconvenienced rather than remorseful. "Sarah, don't make this into something it's not. We'll bring him back a nice souvenir, and I'll visit when we get home next week. Just make sure Mrs. Alvarez is giving him his medications on schedule, okay?" I hung up without a word, my jaw clenched so tight it threatened to fracture. The caregiver watched me with cautious concern. I nodded once, a silent promise that I would not let this injustice stand. Beneath the searing anger, a profound sadness unfurled, but stronger still was the determination to restore dignity to a man cast aside. Mrs. Alvarez appeared with coffee and what looked like freshly made sandwiches. "I heard," she said simply, setting the tray down on the coffee table. "They don't see him anymore." "Not really." Frank's eyes met mine, and in them I saw not just pain, but something unexpected, a flash of the strong, principled man my husband had once described with such admiration. The architect who had refused to compromise his designs for profit, who had chosen to build schools and libraries instead of luxury condos, who had raised 3 children after his wife died of cancer when they were teenagers. "They think I'm already gone," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But I'm still here." I took his hand in mine, feeling the slight tremor that was always present now. "Yes, you are. And we're going to make sure they know it." For the first time since I'd arrived, Frank's face broke into a genuine smile. It transformed him, erasing years of illness and isolation. In that moment, I glimpsed the man my husband had become so distant from, the man who had once built structures to last generations, who understood the importance of strong foundations and enduring connections. "Well then, Sarah," he said, reaching for a sandwich, "perhaps we should start planning." I was gathering the empty plates when I heard him, the soft but unmistakable sound of movement. I turned to see my father-in-law leaning forward, muscles trembling as he pushed against the wheelchair's arms. His eyes locked onto mine, fierce and alive, and I watched in stunned disbelief as he lifted himself from the chair, feet finding the floor for the first time in years. The evening had stretched long, our impromptu birthday celebration evolving from a sad acknowledgement into something unexpectedly meaningful. Mrs. Alvarez had left around 7 after helping Frank into his pajamas and cardigan. I'd promised to stay the night, something I occasionally did when David was away. The apartment had a small guest room that had once belonged to David's younger sister, Diane, the walls still papered with faded flowers and shelves lined with abandoned Nancy Drew mysteries. We'd spent hours talking, really talking, in a way I realized Frank rarely got to anymore. His mind was sharper than his family gave him credit for. Yes, he had moments of confusion, brief lapses where names slipped away, but his long-term memory remained vibrant. He told me stories about designing the public library in Red Hook, about the community center in Flatbush that had survived 3 mayors and countless budget cuts. He described meeting Margaret at a dance in 1963, how she'd worn a blue dress that matched her eyes exactly, how she'd laughed at his terrible jokes and married him 6 months later. He spoke of his children too, David's determination as a boy, his meticulous Lego structures that foreshadowed his future career, Jennifer's fierce independence, Diane's creativity. There was no bitterness in his voice when he talked about them, only a profound sadness that made my own anger feel small and petty by comparison. "They're scared," he said at one point, staring into his teacup as if reading the leaves. "Getting old terrifies them. So does illness. Weakness. They see me and think, that could be me someday." "That's no excuse," I said, more sharply than I intended. Frank smiled sadly. "No, it's not. But understanding helps sometimes." As midnight approached, I'd insisted he get some sleep, promising we'd continue our conversation in the morning. He'd acquiesced with surprising ease, allowing me to wheel him to his bedroom at the end of the hallway. The room was spartanly furnished, a hospital bed, a dresser, a bedside table with neatly arranged medications, and a framed wedding photo. I'd helped him from the wheelchair to the bed, propping pillows behind his back as he'd requested, then returned to the living room to tidy up before retiring myself. I was gathering the empty plates when I heard him, the soft but unmistakable sound of movement. I turned to see my father-in-law leaning forward, muscles trembling as he pushed against the wheelchair's arms. His eyes locked onto mine, fierce and alive, and I watched in stunned disbelief as he lifted himself from the chair, feet finding the floor for the first time in years. Time seemed to slow. My breath caught in my throat, and tears blurred my vision as I rushed to steady him. His body shook with effort, but his posture held the weight of a man reclaiming something precious. "The pretense is over," he said, voice rough but unwavering. "Let's show them, and get our revenge." "Frank," I gasped, my nurse's instincts kicking in as I moved to support him. "You shouldn't be." He raised a hand to silence me, his expression determined. "I can stand, Sarah. I've been practicing with Mrs. Alvarez for months now. Small steps. Building strength." I stood frozen, plates still in my hands, trying to process what I was seeing. Frank had been diagnosed with progressive muscular weakness 2 years ago, shortly after a minor stroke. The doctors had warned the family about deterioration, about the likelihood he would lose mobility entirely. The wheelchair had seemed an inevitability, not a choice. But David said. I began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. "David sees what he expects to see," Frank replied, taking a cautious step forward. His legs trembled visibly with the effort, but he remained upright. "They all do. When Margaret died, they decided I was half gone already. The stroke just confirmed what they'd already decided." "Why didn't you tell them you could stand? That you were getting stronger?" I asked, setting the plates down on the coffee table and moving closer, ready to catch him if he fell. Frank's laugh was short and bitter. "I tried at first. Jennifer said I was confused. Diane worried I would hurt myself. David scheduled another doctor's appointment. He took another step, grimacing slightly. After a while, I stopped trying. It was easier to meet their expectations than fight them." I remembered the conversations I'd overheard between David and his sisters, their casual discussions about Dad's decline, their certainty that he would need full-time care soon, possibly a nursing home. All while he'd been quietly working to regain his strength, with only Mrs. Alvarez as witness and ally. "And today?" I asked softly. "What changed today?" Frank's eyes met mine, bright with purpose. "Today I realized I'd been complicit in my own erasure. I let them treat me like a memento, something to be dusted off for photographs and then tucked away. I let them decide who I was." He took another step, steadier this time. "When you arrived, actually expecting a celebration, actually seeing me, I remembered what it felt like to matter. To be seen." I placed my hand beneath his elbow, supporting his frame as pride and awe flooded through me. In that raw, miraculous moment, the world shifted. He was no longer the helpless victim of abandonment. He was a force of unyielding spirit, and I vowed to stand by him as we faced whatever came next. "We're going to tell them," I said, understanding now what he meant by revenge. "Show them they're wrong about you." Frank nodded, but his expression turned thoughtful. "Not just tell. Show. On my terms, not theirs." He gestured toward the couch. "Let's sit and plan properly. I'm not as steady as I used to be." I helped him to the sofa, studying his face for signs of pain or exhaustion. There was fatigue, certainly, but something else too, a vitality I hadn't seen before, as if the simple act of standing had rekindled something essential within him. "How much can you do?" I asked, my mind already racing ahead to possibilities. "How far can you walk?" "Across the apartment, with breaks," he admitted. "Stairs are still beyond me. But I can stand. I can walk. I can live in this world on my own 2 feet, even if it's just for short distances." I thought about the family in Hawaii, about their casual cruelty, about the assumptions that had allowed them to abandon Frank without a second thought. I thought about David, the man I'd fallen in love with years ago, who had spoken so admiringly of his father's integrity and vision. When had he stopped seeing the man before him? When had convenience replaced compassion? "They should know who you really are," I said, anger and determination mingling in my voice. "Not who they've decided you are." Frank reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Exactly. But not with bitterness. Not with accusations that they can dismiss." His eyes gleamed with a cunning I hadn't anticipated. "We need to be smarter than that." I smiled, beginning to understand. "You want to use their own perceptions against them. They see an old man too feeble to take to Hawaii, too confused to remember his own birthday." Frank's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel. "Let's show them exactly how wrong they are." We sat there on the couch, heads bent together like conspirators. The abandoned birthday decorations surrounding us like the remnants of one story as we began to write another. Frank's voice grew stronger as we talked, his ideas sharper and more focused than I could have imagined from a man his family had dismissed as mentally declining. By the time the clock struck 1, we had the beginnings of a plan, not a scheme of petty vengeance, but a pathway to reclaiming his dignity and, perhaps, awakening his family to the man they'd nearly lost through their own neglect. We spent the next hours planning quietly, voices hushed but hearts ablaze. Sitting side by side at the kitchen table, we drafted messages and imagined how we would confront the family's cruelty. Each idea was tempered with dignity. We wouldn't sink to insults, but we would expose their cowardice and selfishness in a way they could never ignore. Frank insisted we move to the kitchen, a proper war room. He called it with a wry smile. The small table where he used to spread his architectural drawings was now covered with notepads, pens, and mugs of strong black coffee. Despite the late hour, neither of us felt tired. There was something invigorating about purpose, about the shared understanding that had grown between us over the course of this strange, revelatory evening. "They've created a narrative about me," Frank explained, his architect's precision evident in how methodically he laid out the problem. "In their story, I'm already half gone, a burden, an obligation, a sad reminder of mortality." They use that narrative to justify their actions, not just to others but to themselves. I nodded, thinking of how casually Patricia had dismissed Frank on the phone, how David had treated his father's presence at his own birthday as an afterthought. "So we challenge their narrative. We shatter it completely," Frank said, his eyes bright in the harsh kitchen light. "Not with accusations they can dismiss as the ramblings of a confused old man or the interference of an outsider." He gestured toward me with a slight smile. "They'll expect that. They're prepared for it." "Then what?" I asked, curling my fingers around my coffee mug, drawing warmth from it as the night deepened outside the kitchen window. Frank tapped his pen against the notepad. "We show rather than tell. We create evidence they can't refute or explain away." He looked up at me. "I'm thinking of a video. Something simple, direct. Me, speaking clearly about what happened today, about their trip, about the birthday they staged for social media. Facts, not accusations. And we include footage of you standing," I added, understanding where he was going with this. "Walking." "Exactly." Frank's smile had an edge to it now. "Nothing they can dismiss as manipulated or misunderstood. Just the simple truth. I am more present, more capable, and more aware than they've allowed themselves to believe." I considered the idea, imagining the impact of such a video on the family, on David specifically. My husband, who had once spoken of his father with such admiration, now casually dismissing him as an inconvenience. "It's not just about proving them wrong, is it?" I asked softly. "It's about making them face what they've become." Frank nodded slowly, his expression sobering. "They're not bad people, Sarah. They're my children, and I love them. But somewhere along the way, they started seeing me as a project to manage rather than a person to know. They made decisions about who I was, what I needed, what I could understand, without ever asking me. I thought of my own parents, both still active in their 60s, running their small bakery in Astoria with the same enthusiasm they'd had for decades. I couldn't imagine treating them the way the Millers treated Frank. But I also couldn't imagine what it would be like to watch a parent slowly change, to fear losing them by degrees. Fear made people do terrible things sometimes, even to those they loved. "We need to be careful," I said. "This isn't about humiliating them. It's about restoring your relationship." "If that's still possible," Frank added, a hint of vulnerability creeping into his voice for the first time that night. I reached across the table to cover his hand with mine. "It is. They'll be shocked, maybe defensive at first. But underneath that, they'll be relieved. They've been mourning you while you're still here. Imagine how it will feel to get you back." Frank squeezed my hand, then withdrew it to write something on his notepad. "We'll need Mrs. Alvarez's help," he said. "She's been my ally all along. She knows what I can do, what progress I've made." I recalled how Mrs. Alvarez had watched Frank during our evening together, her eyes protective but not patronizing. She saw him clearly, perhaps she always had. "I think she'll be happy to help." We continued planning, the kitchen clock ticking steadily toward dawn. Frank wanted to record the video in his architectural studio, a small room off the main hallway that had been mostly unused since his stroke. David had suggested converting it to a more accessible bedroom months ago, but Frank had refused. Now I understood why. It wasn't stubbornness, as David had claimed, but a silent act of resistance. The studio represented his identity, his capabilities, his refusal to be reduced to just his limitations. I watched him write, fingers unsteady yet determined, his handwriting shaky but legible. He refused pity. He demanded respect. As dusk settled outside, our bond solidified into something fierce and unbreakable. I realized that our revenge wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming his worth, demanding the recognition stolen from him. "What about the medical implications?" I asked eventually, my nurse's training asserting itself. "Your doctors diagnosed progressive muscular weakness. They told the family you wouldn't regain mobility." Frank looked up, a mischievous glint in his eye. "The diagnosis wasn't wrong. But prognosis isn't prophecy, Sarah. Dr. Patel actually encouraged me to work with a physical therapist. He said maintaining whatever strength I could was important, even if full recovery wasn't likely." "And the family didn't know?" "They came to one appointment early on, the one where we discussed worst-case scenarios. After that, they sent Mrs. Alvarez with me. She reported back, but..." He shrugged. "They heard what confirmed their expectations." The unfairness of it struck me anew. Frank had been fighting his own private battle while his family had already written the ending of his story. "They should have been there," I said, unable to keep the anger from my voice. "They should have asked questions, gotten involved in your care." "Yes," Frank agreed simply. "They should have." We fell silent, the weight of that acknowledgement hanging between us. There was hurt here that went beyond today's abandonment, a slow erosion of connection, of mutual respect, of the fundamental recognition of personhood. The Hawaii trip was a symptom, not the disease itself. "Will you still want a relationship with them?" I asked carefully. "After we do this?" Frank considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful in the kitchen's fluorescent light. "They're still my children," he said eventually. "I still love them. But I won't accept being treated as less than human, even by those I love." He looked at me directly. "That's the heart of it, Sarah. I want them back in my life, but on terms that honor my dignity." I nodded, understanding completely. This wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration, of truth, of respect, of authentic connection. By the time night fell, we had crafted a plan that felt righteous. We would broadcast the truth, honest, unvarnished, undeniable, and give his voice back to him. No theatrics, no cruelty, only the clear mirror of their actions reflected back at them. We would film in the morning, when Frank was strongest. Mrs. Alvarez would help, both on camera and behind it. We'd create something simple but powerful, Frank standing from his wheelchair, walking a short distance, speaking clearly about the reality of his condition and his feelings about being excluded from both his birthday celebration and the family vacation. As we finally prepared to get some sleep, Frank reached for his notepad one last time. "There's one more thing," he said, writing something down and tearing off the page. "I want to remind them of this." He handed me the note. On it, he'd written a quote, "The true measure of a society is found in how it treats its most vulnerable members." My father used to say that, Frank explained. I taught it to my children. I wonder if they remember. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my pocket. "We'll remind them," I promised. As I helped Frank back to his bedroom, supporting his elbow as he walked slowly but steadily down the hallway, I felt a strange sense of hope beneath my anger and fatigue. Tomorrow, we would speak truth to power, even if that power was the family I had married into, even if it meant confronting the man I had promised to love until death parted us. In the quiet darkness of Frank's apartment, as I settled onto the narrow bed in Diane's old room, I wondered what this would mean for my marriage. David had excluded me, lied to me by omission if not outright deception. The man I thought I knew would never have abandoned his father this way, would never have staged a false birthday celebration for social media, would never have kept me in the dark about family plans. Yet despite everything, a small voice whispered, "Perhaps there is redemption possible here, not just for Frank but for all of them." Perhaps the truth, however painful, could be the beginning of healing rather than the end of relationships. With that thought flickering like a candle in the darkness, I finally drifted into sleep. The next morning, I dialed my mother-in-law's number while my father-in-law sat upright in bed, alert and resolute. When she answered, I spoke calmly, reciting every hurtful word she had uttered, every moment of abandonment. Her laughter faltered into silence as I invited her to look beyond her tan and cocktails to witness the strength of the man she left behind. Morning light streamed through the half-drawn blinds of Frank's bedroom, painting stripes of gold across the worn hardwood floor. Mrs. Alvarez had arrived early, bringing fresh bagels from the Jewish deli on the corner and a quiet determination that matched our own. Together, we had helped Frank dress in one of his old suits, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, the kind he'd worn to present architectural proposals to city planning boards and wealthy clients. "You look handsome, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Alvarez said, adjusting his tie with maternal precision. "Like the day I first came to work for you." Frank smiled at her, the crow's feet around his eyes deepening. "Thank you, Elena, for everything." I watched their interaction with a pang of tenderness. In many ways, Mrs. Alvarez had become more family to Frank than his actual children, present in ways they were not, attentive to the person he continued to be rather than mourning the person he had been. We'd spent the early hours recording our video. Using my phone propped on a stack of books, we captured Frank's journey from wheelchair to standing, his careful but determined steps across his architectural studio, his clear-eyed narrative of the birthday celebration that never was. We filmed him at his drafting table, explaining a sketch he'd been working on, a community garden pavilion for the senior center 3 blocks away, a pro bono project he'd started before his stroke and continued in moments of clarity and strength. There was no anger in his words, no bitter accusations, only the straightforward truth of his experience and a quiet dignity that made my heart ache. This was the man my husband had once admired enough to follow into the same profession. This was the father who had raised 3 children after losing his wife too young. This was a human being, complex and evolving, neither the titan of his prime nor the invalid of his children's imagination. After Mrs. Alvarez helped Frank settle into a comfortable armchair by the window, not the wheelchair, we'd both insisted on that. I took a deep breath and prepared to make the call that would set everything in motion. "Are you ready?" I asked him, finger hovering over Patricia's contact information on my phone. Frank nodded, his expression serene but determined. "I've been ready for longer than you know." The next morning, I dialed my mother-in-law's number while my father-in-law sat upright in bed, alert and resolute. When she answered, I spoke calmly, reciting every hurtful word she had uttered, every moment of abandonment. Her laughter faltered into silence as I invited her to look beyond her tan and cocktails to witness the strength of the man she left behind. "Sarah," Patricia's voice held cautious confusion. "Is everything all right? Is Dad okay?" "Physically, yes," I replied, keeping my voice level. "But emotionally? No, Patricia, he's not okay. And neither am I." "What are you talking about?" The defensive edge crept into her tone immediately. "If this is still about the birthday mix-up," "It wasn't a mix-up," I interrupted. "It was a deliberate exclusion. You staged a celebration for social media, then abandoned Frank on his actual birthday to go to Hawaii, a trip no one bothered to tell me about either." "Now wait just a minute." "No, you wait," I said, not raising my voice but infusing it with a firmness that silenced her. "Yesterday on the phone, you called your father, and I'm quoting you directly, a useless old man. You laughed about leaving him behind." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "I was joking," Patricia finally said, her voice smaller. "It was just dark humor. You know how stressful it's been, dealing with Dad's condition." "Do I?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, you haven't been dealing with it at all. You've been avoiding it. You've been writing your father off while he's still very much alive and aware." "That's not fair," Patricia protested. "We've paid for the best care. We visit when we can, when it's convenient," I corrected. "When it fits your schedule and your comfort level. But Frank Miller isn't a checkbox on your to-do list or a prop for your Instagram. He's a person with thoughts, feelings, capabilities, and dignity." I heard her inhale sharply. "I don't appreciate your tone, Sarah. You're not family, not really. You've been married to David for what, 3 years? I've been Frank's daughter for 45 years. Don't presume to lecture me about my own father." The comment was designed to wound, to put me in my place as an outsider, but I refused to be deflected. "I'm not presuming anything. I'm simply stating facts. And here's another fact. Frank has been working with his physical therapist for months. He can stand. He can walk short distances. Did you know that?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Patricia," I continued, softening my tone slightly, "I'm not your enemy here. Neither is Frank. What we want, what he deserves, is to be seen as he actually is, not as who you've decided he is." "David?" Patricia's voice suddenly shifted away from the phone. "David, you need to talk to Sarah. She's making wild claims about Dad." I heard rustling as the phone changed hands, then my husband's voice, guarded and concerned. "Sarah? What's going on?" "I have someone here who wants to speak with you," I said, then handed the phone to Frank. His voice was steady as he described his pain and his pride. I felt his words reverberate through me, each one a hammer striking falsehoods into dust. On the other end of the line, I could almost hear the trembling shame in her breath. Our quiet dignity was their undoing. "David," Frank began, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in months. "It's your father." A pause, then David's voice, wary and confused. "Dad? Are you okay?" "No, son, I'm not. I haven't been okay for some time, but not for the reasons you think." Frank spoke for nearly 10 minutes without interruption. He described waking up on his birthday to an empty apartment save for Mrs. Alvarez. He recounted hearing about the family vacation from which he'd been excluded without discussion or explanation. He detailed the months of physical therapy, the small victories and continued challenges of his condition, the cognitive clarity that persisted despite occasional lapses. "I'm not what I was," Frank acknowledged, his voice gentle but firm. "The stroke took things from me that I won't get back. But I'm still here, David. I'm still thinking, feeling, growing, adapting. I'm still your father." The silence from the other end was profound. I could only imagine David's expression, the slow crumbling of the narrative he'd constructed to justify his actions. "I don't want your guilt," Frank continued. "I want your presence. I want your honesty. I want you to see me as I am, not as who I was, not as who you fear I'll become, but as who I am today." He gestured to me, and I moved closer with the phone, opening the video we'd recorded and pressing send. "I've asked Sarah to send you something," Frank explained. "Please watch it. Then call me back when you're ready to talk, really talk." When the call ended, we shared a long look, no celebration needed. He had reclaimed his power. I had stood witness. The victory wasn't loud, but it resonated deeper than any cheer. Mrs. Alvarez quietly excused herself to make tea, giving us a moment alone. Frank reached for my hand, his grip firm despite the slight tremor. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" I asked. "I didn't fix anything." "You saw me," he replied. "When everyone else had decided who I was, you looked and actually saw me. That's no small thing, Sarah." The truth of his words settled around us like a blanket. In a world that too often reduced people to their limitations, to diagnoses and prognoses, to convenient narratives that allowed for distance and detachment, simply being seen for who you are could be revolutionary. We sat in comfortable silence until Mrs. Alvarez returned with tea. The three of us, unlikely allies in this quiet rebellion against erasure, sipped from mismatched mugs and waited. The ball was in the family's court now. They could choose denial, anger, evasion, or they could choose truth, however uncomfortable. My phone rang 20 minutes later. David's name flashed on the screen. I showed it to Frank, silently asking if he wanted to answer. He nodded, but didn't reach for the phone. "Put it on speaker," he said. "We're in this together now." I answered, activating the speakerphone function. "Hello?" I saw the video. David's voice was hoarse as if he'd been crying. "Dad, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Frank replied gently. "Just listen." "I'm listening," David whispered. "I want you to come home, you and your sisters," Frank said. "Not to apologize, not to make amends, but to start over. To meet me where I am now, not where you remember me being or where you fear I'll end up." The silence stretched for several seconds. "When?" David finally asked. "You said you'd be back next week." "That's soon enough," Frank answered. "Enjoy the rest of your vacation. Be with your family. But when you return, come see me, really see me." "I will, Dad," David promised, his voice cracking slightly. "We all will." After a few more words, the call ended. The three of us sat in the warm morning light, the moment fraught with possibility rather than certainty. There were no guarantees that the family would follow through, that they would truly change their perspective, that the patterns of years could be rewritten in days or weeks. But something had shifted. A truth had been spoken that could not be unheard. A reality had been witnessed that could not be unseen. Frank had stood on his own 2 feet, literally and metaphorically, and demanded recognition of his full humanity. I looked at him now, sitting in his armchair with tea in hand, gazing out at the Brooklyn street below with clear eyes. Whatever came next, reconciliation or continued struggle, healing or hard truths, he would face it with the dignity he had reclaimed for himself. And I would stand beside him, bearing witness to the quiet revolution of being fully seen. Weeks passed, and the family remained silent. But the air in my father-in-law's home felt lighter, infused with newfound respect and peace. He regained small freedoms, reading without guilt, laughing without apology, existing unapologetically. Each day, he walked a little farther, his steps imbued with the knowledge that he was not disposable. The spring sunshine warmed the Brooklyn streets outside Frank's apartment, coaxing the first tentative blooms from window boxes and tiny tree pits. I had taken to spending more time at his place, even as my relationship with David remained in a strange, suspended state. We spoke on the phone occasionally, tense, careful conversations that skirted the deeper wounds still too raw to address. David and his family had returned from Hawaii as scheduled, their suntanned faces and forced smiles appearing in fresh social media posts that notably lacked any mention of Frank. But true to David's word, they had come to visit. All 3 siblings, without spouses or children, arriving at Frank's door with hesitant expressions and awkward gifts. I had been there that day, preparing to leave when they arrived, but Frank had asked me to stay. "We're all family here," he'd said firmly, meeting each of his children's eyes in turn. The visit had been strained, conversation halting and superficial at first. But something remarkable had happened when Frank had stood up from his armchair, using his cane for support, and walked slowly to his architectural studio to show them his community garden pavilion sketches. The collective shock on their faces had given way to something more complex: shame, yes, but also a dawning recognition of the man their father still was. Jennifer had been the first to really engage, asking questions about the design, her architectural knowledge less technical than David's, but her interest genuine. Diane had followed, tentatively at first, then with growing animation as Frank explained his vision for a space that would serve elderly residents of the neighborhood. David had remained quiet, watching his father with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, wonder, perhaps, or grief for what he'd nearly lost through his own neglect. That visit had not healed everything, how could it, but it had cracked open a door that had been firmly shut. In the weeks since, Frank had flourished in subtle but unmistakable ways. Mrs. Alvarez reported that he was more engaged with his physical therapy, more consistent with his exercises. He had begun venturing outside the apartment with her assistance, first just to the stoop to feel the sunshine, then gradually to the corner bodega, the local park, even to his favorite diner 3 blocks away. I stood by him, proud and humbled, learning that true revenge isn't destruction, it's restoration. Together, we rebuilt what abandonment had tried to erase, his sense of worth, my sense of purpose, and our shared conviction that dignity endures even when everything else is stripped away. Today, I had arrived to find Frank sitting at his kitchen table with newspapers spread around him, circling listings with a red pen. "What are you doing?" I asked, setting down the groceries I'd brought. Fresh vegetables for soup, sourdough bread from the bakery he loved, dark chocolate for the dessert Mrs. Alvarez had been teaching me to make. "Looking for a new place," he answered, not looking up. "Something on the first floor, maybe with a small garden. This building has too many stairs." I paused in unpacking the groceries, surprised by this new development. "You want to move?" Frank finally looked up, his eyes clear and determined. "I need to, Sarah. I've been avoiding it because it felt like surrender, like admitting I would never manage those stairs again. But now I understand that adapting isn't the same as giving up." I sat down across from him, studying the circled listings. They were all in Brooklyn, most in neighborhoods not far from this one, places where Frank had connections, history, community. "Have you told the family?" He nodded. "Called them yesterday. Jennifer is coming with me to look at a couple of these on Saturday." Jennifer? Of the 3 siblings, she had been the most distant before our confrontation, the one who had most strongly advocated for moving Frank to an assisted living facility. A small smile touched Frank's lips. "She's been calling every few days. Actually listening now, not just checking a box on her to-do list." He tapped the newspaper. "She's the one who suggested I might be happier in a place without stairs, where I could have a bit of outdoor space." I felt a surge of cautious hope. This was precisely what we had worked for, not punishment, but restoration of real connection. "That's wonderful, Frank." "It's a start," he acknowledged, tempering his optimism with the realism that had always been part of his character. "We have a long way to go." "And David?" I asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. Frank's expression softened. "He's trying, Sarah. In his own way. He stops by on his lunch break sometimes. Doesn't say much, but he's here." The pain and confusion I'd been carrying about my marriage must have shown on my face, because Frank reached across the table to cover my hand with his. "He's ashamed," he said quietly, "of how he treated me, of keeping you in the dark about Hawaii. Shame makes people retreat. Give him time." I nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. The betrayal still stung, not just the lie about the business trip or the exclusion from the family vacation, but the fundamental breakdown of trust, the revelation that the man I'd married was capable of such callousness toward his own father. Yet I couldn't deny that something was shifting, however slowly. 2 days ago, David had left a voice message asking if we could meet for coffee. I hadn't responded yet, unsure what I wanted or needed from that conversation. "Whatever you decide about David," Frank said, seeming to read my thoughts, "know that you will always be family to me. You saw me when no one else did. That bond doesn't disappear, regardless of legal documents or last names." His words eased something tight in my chest. In this complicated human tangle of hurt and healing, at least this connection remained clear and true. Mrs. Alvarez arrived soon after, bringing with her the physical therapist who now came to the apartment 3 times a week. Frank excused himself for his session, moving to the living room where they had cleared space for his exercises. I stayed in the kitchen, preparing the vegetables for soup, listening to the muted voices from the other room, the therapists. Encouraging instructions, Frank's determined responses, the occasional burst of triumphant laughter when he mastered a new movement or beat his previous record. In that quiet, reclaimed life, we discovered something greater than vengeance, redemption, resilience, and the unwavering truth that dignity endures even when everything else is stripped away. As I chopped carrots and celery, I thought about the word revenge that Frank had used that night when he first stood from his wheelchair. What we had achieved wasn't revenge in any traditional sense. We hadn't exposed the family to public ridicule or cut them out of our lives. We hadn't matched cruelty with cruelty or abandonment with abandonment. Instead, we had insisted on truth. We had demanded recognition. We had refused to accept the convenient narrative that allowed Frank to be dismissed and diminished. Our revenge had been to restore his humanity in the eyes of those who had stopped seeing it, and perhaps to restore their own humanity in the process. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflections. Mrs. Alvarez appeared in the kitchen doorway. "It's David," she said, her expression carefully neutral. My heart stuttered in my chest. He was early for his usual lunch break visit, and he hadn't mentioned coming today when we last spoke. "Should I tell him you're here?" she asked. I nodded, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Yes, I'll talk to him." David stood awkwardly in the entryway, looking both familiar and strange to me. His hair was slightly longer than he usually kept it, curling at the edges in a way that reminded me of old photos of Frank from the 1970s. He held a thick manila envelope in his hands, turning it nervously between his fingers. "Sarah," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I didn't know you'd be here." "I brought groceries," I replied, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen. "Your dad is with his physical therapist." David nodded, glancing toward the living room where his father's voice could be heard counting repetitions. "He sounds stronger." "He is stronger," I confirmed. "In many ways." The silence stretched between us, taut with all the things we hadn't said to each other in the weeks since his return from Hawaii. Finally, David held out the envelope. "These are for Dad," he explained. "Preliminary sketches for the community garden pavilion." I thought, maybe we could work on it together. Father and son. Like we used to. The gesture was so unexpected, so perfectly attuned to what Frank might actually want rather than what David thought he needed, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. "He'd love that," I said softly. David swallowed hard, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "And this," he added, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket, "is for you. If you want it." I took it cautiously, unfolding it to find a reservation confirmation for a small Italian restaurant in Manhattan, the place where we'd had our first date 5 years ago. "Just dinner," David clarified quickly. "To talk. Nothing more, nothing expected. I need to explain. To apologize. To understand how we got here." I refolded the paper, neither accepting nor rejecting the invitation outright. "I don't know if I'm ready." "I understand," he said, and for perhaps the first time since this all began, I believed that he actually did. "The reservation is for Friday. If you come, I'll be there. If not." He shrugged, a gesture of surrender rather than dismissal. "I'll keep trying." From the living room, Frank's voice rose in triumph. 12. "That's a new record," followed by the therapist's enthusiastic praise. David's head turned at the sound, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips. "He's still teaching me things," he said quietly. "Still showing me what strength really looks like." In that moment, I glimpsed the man I had fallen in love with, the one who had spoken of his father with such admiration, who had wanted to build beautiful, useful things that would outlast him. He was still there, beneath the layers of fear and avoidance that had nearly destroyed our family. Whether that was enough to rebuild what had been broken between us, I didn't yet know. But as David carefully placed his envelope on the hall table and turned to leave, giving me the space I had not explicitly asked for but clearly needed, I felt something unfurl within me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but its first tentative possibility. Friday, I said as he reached the door. I'll think about it. He nodded once, accepting this small concession as the precious thing it was, then left without pushing for more. I returned to the kitchen, to the half-chopped vegetables and the soup that would soon fill the apartment with the scent of home and care. Through the doorway, I could see Frank completing his exercises, his movements slow but purposeful, his face set in concentration. This was the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. Not the end of struggle or pain or misunderstanding, but a commitment to facing those challenges with honesty and dignity. Not the fairy tale ending where all wounds are magically healed, but the real-world beginning where healing becomes possible through daily choices and consistent presence. In choosing truth over comfortable fiction, in demanding recognition rather than accepting erasure, in standing firm in our shared humanity despite everything that threatened to diminish it, we had found something more valuable than revenge could ever be. We had found our way back to one another and back to ourselves.